Hello again, and this is part 2 of our series of mini lectures for the topic vulnerable populations. So hopefully you've managed to complete some of the activities and readings, and this section of the lecture series will just hopefully bring together the main areas to focus on and hopefully summarize some of the main key points. So let's begin by just looking at the Mental Health Act in more depth. Now, this Act reflects Principle 3 of the UN Principles for the Protection of Persons with Mental Illness, which states that every person with a mental illness shall have the right to live and work to the extent possible in the community. Remembering that this iteration of the Mental Health Act is in direct contrast to the older traditional views of mental health and the treatment, care and control of patients that have gone in the past. It's very much about being inclusive, and it's always its main focus is sort of delivering care and treatment in the least restrictive environment possible. So that's important to remember. So the Act is a legislative or legal framework that outlines the principles of care and treatment for people who have a mental illness and or disorder. So it's the legal guidelines that inform carers, health practitioners, and anyone involved in care of people with a mental illness. So again, remembering our policies and health directives, this is where we get our policies from, the actual Act. And when you remember that case that I highlighted in the introductory lecture, you can see why it's so important that people adhere to the proper care and treatment, because individuals are responsible. We have the guidelines, and when people don't do the right thing from a system and an individual care and ethical perspective, awful things happen. Now, each state and territory has its own Mental Health Act that deals with consent pertaining to individuals experiencing mental illness. Now, there's vast similarities between each state and territory, but just some of the definitions can vary in relation to some illnesses. So that's probably one of the main differences. So it always, if you go to work in Queensland, obviously the policy that you will be working under will be directly articulated from the Mental Health Act of Queensland. But by and large, they're very, very similar. So what's the purpose of the Mental Health Act? Well, you've got some key points written on this slide, but essentially, as I've said, one of the main purposes is to protect the individual's rights and provide access to appropriate treatment and care. It's to facilitate the involvement of patients and carers in decisions about their care and treatment. And again, that's a major focus, because in the past, many patients who had a mental illness had absolutely no rights at all. So I would like to just share with you, if you haven't already done so, I want to take you to a very useful resource, and this is the Mental Health Act Guidebook. If I can find it, Now, I've just taken you to the New South Wales Institute of Psychiatry, and for those students who wish to read further in this area, this is an excellent website that contains numerous fact sheets and resources, and it's from this very website that I actually have prepared the link for you for the Mental Health Act Guidebook, which is a really great resource, and it's this one here. So I'll just open this up, because it's meant to inform anyone who has an interest or a family member, whether you work in mental health, whether you have an interest in the area, but this guidebook is the user-friendly version of being able to interpret what is a very complex legislative piece of writing. So it puts it in user-friendly form. So I really encourage you to access this. The link is in your module, but I've taken you to the website where it comes from because there's lots more information for those who may be interested. So just scrolling down, you have to do this in your tutorials as well, but most importantly, Chapter 1 outlines the purpose and aims of the Mental Health Act. We're going to talk about in a little minute definitions, mental illness, mental disorder, and so on. Who is a voluntary patient, involuntary admissions. So it's extremely comprehensive, and what I really like about it, it is very, very easy to read. So that's an excellent resource for you. Now, one of the learning objectives that you have to achieve following completion of this module is that you understand the terminology, and two terms that it is vital to understand is what is meant by mental illness as opposed to a mental disorder, because they're quite distinct. So two key definitions that anyone working within the boundaries of the Mental Health Act, and that applies to any nurses, and you must understand them, as I've said, is mentally ill person and a mentally disordered person, because these definitions provide the framework for many of the decisions made by health professionals, particularly in relation to admission under the Mental Health Act. And for those of you who are unaware, there's two types of admission. There's voluntary admission, where someone can present to a mental health facility of their own accord, and then there's involuntary admission, which means when someone's very, very ill, they present a threat to themselves or the public, then under the Mental Health Act, if they meet the criteria for being mentally ill and they meet certain criteria, well, that's when their rights are put aside, if you like, and then for their own health and safety, we take them to hospital. But it's very, very heavily legislated, and there's lots of rules and regulations surrounding that. So let's look at mental illness and how it is defined under the Act. And that's what it is, simply a definition. But again, you'll talk about this more when you do NRS 222, but when someone has a mental illness, it is characterized by the presence of one or more of the following symptoms. They must have delusions, hallucinations, and so on. Again, your New South Wales Mental Health Act guidebook that I just highlighted earlier goes into this in a lot more depth. All right, so they must meet that criteria. The main characteristic of serious disorder of thought is a loss of coherence. And that's one of the most important ones. One idea that the person's having doesn't logically link to the next. There's a severe disturbance and it's a profound change in mood that really changes a person's ability to function. And that's important. Something like when they're very ill with a florid exacerbation of schizophrenia, for example. Criteria for a mentally ill person. So we've defined mental illness. We'll now look at how someone is determined to meet the criteria to be mentally ill under the Mental Health Act. So you've got to have the mental illness by the definition. So we're talking about when someone has to go to hospital, perhaps against their will, or be involuntarily admitted. And at the same time, they've got to have a risk of serious harm to themselves or others. Now that harm, what is serious harm? It's a broad term that can best be understood in terms of its everyday usage, and it can include physical harm, harm to reputation and relationships, financial harm, self-neglect, neglect of others, for example, their children. You know, and you might think, where does financial harm come into this? Well, for example, someone suffering from bipolar disorder, when they're very manic in that heightened phase, you know, there's lots of cases where people will go out, spend all their money, and yeah, just part of their illness. So you'll look at the case of Kevin in your tutes, and, you know, you can ask your tutors any of those sort of for further clarification there. So as well as the risk of serious harm, they must have, it's a continuing condition and it's likely to deteriorate, and that's taken into account. And there must be no other care of a less restrictive kind available. And this again is one of the main principles under the Act, so that when someone is taken against their will, or what we call scheduled or involuntarily removed from the community to a mental health facility, there must be no other type of safe and effective care that's appropriate at that time or available at that time. So that's important, because again, from a traditional perspective, when you think historically, someone in the community who was unwell, they were just immediately taken to a secure mental health unit. So that's why the Act is very, very specific there, that certain criteria must be met. So the other definition under the Act, and again, if you need further clarification, look at your guidebook, but it's the mentally disordered person. So a mentally disordered person is someone whose behaviour for the time being is so irrational that there are reasonable grounds for deciding that they need care, treatment and control on a temporary basis. And I suppose you think it's quite, students sometimes have difficulty distinguishing between mental illness and mental disorder, but the way that I've understood it is that I think a mental disorder is something that someone might have for a period of time in their life and then never have it again. And to give an example, say someone who, following a relationship breakup, appears to be actively suicidal. That it is a transient thing, but for that period of time, they do need care, treatment and control under the Act. All right, but when you look at the processes for admission, involuntary admission, you will see that depending on your diagnosis, and it has to be very strictly monitored, the length of time that you will be in hospital is very, very bounded by the law. For example, someone who's having a mental disorder, they might be there for 5 days, whereas someone who's diagnosed as mentally ill, it might go on for a period of weeks. But throughout that time, regardless of diagnosis, it is every person who presents to a mental health facility involuntarily, they will be checked and checked again. You know, there's lots of assessments, and yes, so it's not just someone is put into hospital and they, you know, are left there. So it's very, very clear. But again, these two terms are vital to understand. You will be tested on them, multiple choice questions. So please look at the Mental Health Act and the guidebook in particular, because it explains it very, very well.